Hello and welcome to Curiosity Cake. I'm your host Lee Delaney. On this episode I'm talking to biologist and author Melanie Peffer. Melanie has a PhD in molecular biology from the University of Pittsburgh. She has a strong interest in the science of learning, particularly applied to science, and her new book Biology Everywhere draws on her research on how people learn and understand biology to provide an evidence-based, accessible approach to introducing the biology all around us. Don't forget, if you follow Curiosity Cake on Twitter or Instagram, I'll be switching the names of those accounts to my actual name so I can use them to post about both Curiosity Cake and Introvert Evolution, my career coaching business for introverts. I'm also moving the Curiosity Cake website to be part of introvertevolution.com, where I'll be doing more blogging about introversion careers, podcasting and more. And you can actually check out my first blog post on the last episode of Curiosity Cake talking about Coffin Club. As always, hit the subscribe button, rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser and Good Pods, and follow me on Twitter and Instagram via the links. Now get yourself a cup of tea, grab a fork and dig into a slice of Curiosity Cake. Curiosity Cake. Hi Melanie, welcome to Curiosity Cake. Thanks very much for giving me your time.
Thank you for having me today. It's great to be here.
So you're a biologist, you've written a book about biology. Can you tell us a bit about your biology background and what brought you to wanting to write a book?
Yeah, absolutely. So my bachelor's degree and my doctoral degree are both in molecular biology. And I got halfway through my graduate program before realizing it really wasn't what I wanted to be doing. I had passions for education and teaching and research and biology and just didn't have a good sense of how to bring those things together. And so when I finished graduate school, I actually ended up doing a postdoctoral fellowship in the learning sciences instead and switched my focus to studying how people learn biology. And so as part of that journey and then teaching in the classroom, I noticed how many people just really don't like science and biology. I've had way too many students and friends and families come up to me and say something along the lines of, I'm not good at biology. I had a terrible experience in my science classes. I'm not good at science. I'm not smart enough to do it. And it was really hard for me to hear, both as an educator who loves science and biology and as a researcher who studies how people learn science and biology. And it's just like, well, how do we make sense of all this? And so when I was teaching non-science majors, general biology classes, I really switched my teaching approach around with these students and made it so that it was really focused on what we see outside the classroom and how biology intersects with other disciplines. And we went from the beginning of the semester where students were saying, I hate science, I'm not good at it, I'm just taking this to meet my graduation requirements, to the end of the semester where they're saying, this was my first positive experience in a science class. And so, this happened multiple times in different semesters, and it was also, I wanted to switch my career trajectory a little bit, and that's why I wrote the book. Mm-hmm. Because I was taking that approach that works so well with my students and put it in the book to reach a broader audience. So that's why I wrote the book, and I think it's important for people to pick up the book because we don't have a choice but to engage with science and biology. And when we start thinking about science and biology as just a natural thing that's part of our lives, it's easier to engage with. And so when we have to engage with bigger issues, whether it's the COVID pandemic or climate change, then it's much easier to engage with these big issues that really affect all of our lives in a profound way.
Mm-hmm. And before we go any further, you should tell us what the book's called.
Oh, yeah. So my book is called Biology Everywhere, How the Science of Life Matters to Everyday Life.
Which sounds like a really great title and a really great way to approach the subject. I have a background in maths, and people have very similar reactions to that.
Yep.
Lots of people have very horrific experiences in school around maths. And I still have a friend that I've known for about 20 something years. She always posts things on social media about how she's not using trigonometry in her everyday life.
Yeah, exactly. And I kind of remember watching a video when I was in school that was talking about where we see math in our daily lives, but the video was like 20 years old, 20 years ago. Hopefully people have done updates of that.
Fingers crossed, yeah. So what is it about biology that makes you so passionate about it and makes you want to kind of reach out to beyond the academic audience to ordinary people?
So there's two parts to this question. So I've always been really interested in science and biology. My mom used to joke around that I was the kid that wanted to watch um, science shows on the TV instead of cartoons. And I always really gravitated towards the biology ones and learning and understanding how the world works. And when I took genetics as an undergraduate student, um, we learned about cell signaling. I was just hooked on molecular biology from that point on. I just found the way that cells work to talk to one another and then how that all fits into why we're here to just be so fascinating. And when it comes about thinking about it in our daily lives, I feel like we run into biology everywhere. I think we see a lot of different science coming up every day, but just my lens, I see more of the biology everywhere. And so many different biology questions come up in society.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these are really big questions. So there's conservation issues, there's things with climate change, there's the pandemic, there's genetic technologies is a big one right now. And should we be able to patent human genes, and the how the global consortium about sequencing cancer genomes. There's so much out there, and so many of these are decisions we have to make every day. It's are plastic bag bans actually worthwhile? Do they help people go greener? How do we make green decisions? Do we vote to reintroduce endangered species? Do we like this genetic technology or that technology? And what are the ethics of that? And should we do it? And we don't have a choice but to engage in biology. And these are some pretty big questions that really affect our lives. And so that's part of why I've done the outreach that I've done, is that we have to make these decisions, and we need to be thoughtful about how they make these decisions, because they really matter for ourselves and for our families and for society.
And the book really covers that wide range of topics that you see biology in. But one of the things I was really interested in with your book is that you actually start off early on in the book talking about chemistry. So why do you start a book about biology talking about chemistry?
Yeah, absolutely. So biology everywhere covers all the content you'd see in a typical general biology course. And then the last third is my favorite part of the book, and it's biology as it intersects with other disciplines. So intersections of biology and the arts and music, intersections of biology and psychology, business, education. But you're asking about why start with chemistry, and it's because chemistry and biology overlap quite a bit. So I remember my professors in college talking about chemistry as essential science, because we have to understand chemistry to understand biology, and we have to understand chemistry in order to understand physics as well. And I alluded to this a little bit when I was talking about cell signaling, but our biological processes work because of chemistry. When you look out the window and you see something, it's because of chemical reactions that happened in your eye. When we think about metabolism slowing down as we age or whatever, things changing after having children, that's chemistry too. Mm-hmm. What we eat in the morning and whether or not we're hungry an hour later or not, that's chemistry as well.
So I think it's a bit along the lines of the different scientific disciplines are looking at the world at different levels. So a couple of episodes ago, I was talking to a particle physicist, obviously doing research at that particle level. You go a level up and then you get into the kind of chemicals and compounds that make up chemistry, and then you go a level up, and is that the biology area where those particles, those chemicals, they're combining, as you're saying, in these biological forms and biological processes?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about molecular biology, and I often get questions about molecular biology versus microbiology. And so molecular biology is how atoms are coming together to make things like proteins, for example, and thinking about how proteins interact with one another. And microbiology is the study of microbes, so viruses, bacteria, So it's a bigger scale than molecular biology. And then we have ecology, which is at really big level. So at the organismal level and how different organisms are interacting with one another.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a favorite chapter in your book? I know you're covering a lot of kind of wide areas there, but is there one thing in particular that if people could only read that one chapter, you'd want to make sure they read it?
Ooh, that's a really hard one because if I was just going to direct people to one chapter, it might be one of the more general chapters of why
Mm-hmm.
biology everywhere and that biology everywhere mindset really matters.
Mm-hmm.
Because as I've mentioned before, because it really matters for the health and welfare of society. It's not just that acknowledging biology around us enriches our lives. It's really important
Mm-hmm.
to taking care of ourselves and each other. But content wise, I love the chapter on science and the arts and music. I am a lifelong musician. I think that people oftentimes overlook the fact that science and creativity and the arts are so tightly interwoven with one another. And it kind of gets away from that idea that it's science or arts and showing how they're
Mm-hmm.
really integrated with one another. And I think that's surprising for people and also gives us a better idea of how science works, that it's not this boring static process that just generates facts that we go into science classes to memorize, that it's actually this creative dynamic process instead.
So can you give us some more detail then on how biology relates to music?
So there's two ways of thinking about this. And first is that biology can tell us about our experience with the arts. And so I don't know, what's your favorite piece of music? What do you really like to listen to?
Oh, do you know what? I used to play a lot of music, listen to a lot of music, and I've actually just really lost the interest in music as time's gone on. But I still have a bit of a love of some of the things I used to listen to when I was younger, like Metallica and things like that, like the old kind of Metallica.
Old
Um,
Metallica?
yeah, I love that sound of the electric guitar, that sort of metal kind of thump.
Okay. So you ever get chills when you listen to that kind of music or goosebumps?
I definitely have, and particularly when I've seen it live, and other kinds of music as well.
Yeah, so that feeling of getting chills when you listen to music or getting goosebumps, that's because a chemical called dopamine is released in your brain.
Mhm.
And scientists have actually studied this and shown that if you block dopamine release when people listen to moving music, it's not moving to them anymore. And if you do the reverse and cause a lot of dopamine to be released in the brain, then it's this amazing experience listening to the music. And so biology tells us about our experience with the arts. And there's also emotional and physiological connections that we make with those that we make music with, which is really fascinating. There was a study done in Sweden showing that people who sing together synchronize their heart rates. And
Hmm.
this, how powerful of an experience it is making music with others, is thought to have been essential for human evolution. This idea that making music together created a more cohesive group. So when we think about the hunter-gatherer history of humans, having a cohesive group you could depend on was a big deal for surviving.
Singing maybe seems like something musical that you do have a very, or maybe a more obvious kind of link to biology there, because obviously you're using your body and your lungs.
Yeah, absolutely. So biology tells us about our experience with music, and also, especially when you think about the fine arts, not music as much, but the fine arts in particular,
Mm.
about how much that's influenced the process of science. My favorite story that I always tell is about Santiago Ramon y Cajal. He was a Spanish scientist, and he's known as the father of neuroscience. And he wanted to be an artist, and
Mm.
his dad kind of pushed him into going into medicine instead. And he's known as the father of neuroscience because he came up with what's called the neuron doctrine, or that the fundamental unit of our brains is a cell called a neuron.
Mhm.
And he came up with the neuron doctrine because he repeatedly drew neural tissue. He was an artist. He liked to draw. So he did all these studies looking under the microscope about what neural tissue looked like. And so it was that artistic ability to sit and draw that led to him coming up with the idea of the neuron doctrine, something that he went on to win the Nobel Prize for. And you can still find his images. They're in modern textbooks today,
Mhm.
and they also tour the world in art exhibitions too because they're beautiful.
Wow, that sounds fantastic. One of the other things I was really drawn to in your book was the idea that water is sticky. So,
Yes.
you have a chapter that's talking about water, how important it is for life. And I came across this sentence and I just thought, wow, that's really interesting. So can you tell us how that actually works? How can water be sticky?
Yeah, absolutely. So it comes down to electrostatic properties. So before I lose you with electrostatic, if you think about being a little kid and you have a balloon and you rub it on the top of your head and it makes your hair stand up.
Yep, done that.
Yeah, so that's electrostatic. And so water behaves the same way, and that's what makes water sticky. And so if you look at a water molecule, it's shaped like an L. It's a 90-degree angle.
Mm-hmm.
And one side of it is positively charged and the other side is negatively charged. And so because it's got this polarity, that's what allows it to stick, just like a balloon would stick to your hair and make it stand up. And so water is really good at sticking to itself and sticking to other things. And so that explains why, for example, you can have a big tree and water is able to get the whole way up to the top because the water sticks to itself to make a chain. You can almost think of it like people holding hands or like a bucket brigade. They're all holding onto each other. And we also stick to the inside of the tree and can crawl up because we've all seen put a straw in a drink and seen the water or whatever you're drinking climb up the straw as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so does that also explain that, when it rains, you've got the raindrops that kind of stay on your window for a while afterwards still?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, because water wants to stick to itself and stick to the window.
So the importance of water for life, then tell us about that.
So part of why water is so important for life is that it facilitates chemical reactions to occur. And so water is really good at dissolving things. So we've all dissolved sugar or something else into, tea or whatever we're drinking. And so because water is a good solvent, the reactions that need to occur that keep us upright and functioning, they work better because they're in water.
Mm-hmm. And then another element of the book that you talk about that, again, is really important for life is light and how it contributes to plant life on the planet. And I'm sure everyone remembers this from school, the idea of photosynthesis. But maybe you can kind of go into a bit of depth on the process of photosynthesis, because I think that's a particularly interesting one. We think very much of as humans, we grow and develop from eating food, but for plants, they're actually using light as their equivalent of food. So I'm very curious about how that works.
Yes, I'm glad you asked about photosynthesis because usually in biology classes, anything that has to do with plants gets skipped, which is a little bit unfortunate, especially when we sit and really think about what photosynthesis is. So if we break it down, this photosynthesis is another one of those nice biology terms that everybody had to memorize in school. So photo is light and synthesis is to make something. So we make with light. And the reason this is such a big deal is because photosynthesis is taking light and using it to make food. And so plants are what's called an autotroph. So the auto means self, like somebody writes an autobiography, and a troph is to feed. And so they can self-feed. So rather than needing to get their food from somewhere else, a lot of people think that the plant's food is the dirt. That's actually not the case. Plants get their food from the sun. And so they're able to take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and sunlight. So the sunlight's the energy that they use to do this, to power these reactions, and can completely make food on their own. So they don't need to go to the grocery store. They don't need certain nutrients to be given to them. They just have the sun and CO2 gas, and they can use that to make glucose and food. And then that forms the basis of the food chain, because then, the next animal can get their food from the plant. So we have to depend on autotrophs like plants in order to eat. And so if we didn't have plants, there would be no life on Earth.
You're talking there about the photosynthesis being used to produce glucose, and in the middle of that is carbon. When you talk in that chapter about the fact that life is based on carbon. But I think at one point I came across a documentary that was talking about, I think it was at the bottom of the ocean somewhere, and I'm sure they were talking about some crazy little animals at the bottom of the sea that were based on sulfur or something like that. Now, I might have dreamt this and I might have completely made it up. So is it is all life, wherever it is, if we travel galaxies away, life there would be carbon based and everything here is carbon based, or actually could life be based on something different?
Yeah, so you bring up two different things. And so life at the bottom of the ocean, for a while, scientists didn't believe there could be life at the bottom of the ocean because they thought all life on Earth depended on the sun. And so sun can't reach the whole way to the bottom of the ocean. So they didn't think there could be life down there. And then in the 1980s, they found life down there and they were trying to figure out where that energy was coming from in the first place. So who were the autotrophs down there? Because it's not plants. And they actually found that it's bacteria that are able to use the hydrogen sulfides that are coming up from the Earth's crust. And they form the basis of the food chain, the energy chain down at the bottom of the ocean. So yes, it is sulfides at the bottom of the ocean. And with life on other planets, it's a good question. Is it CO2? Is it sulfides? I don't know. Some people have proposed that it could be silicon based because silicon has very similar chemistry to carbon as far as elements go, but be curious to see. I find it interesting. I'm not too far from Yellowstone National Park, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's one of the biggest places in the entire world for geothermal activity. And NASA scientists study there quite a bit to see the life that lives in these hot springs, because it could give us an indicator of what kind of life we could look for in other parts of the solar system.
So going back to the idea of carbon, and I know you've mentioned climate change and you talk about climate change a lot in the book. If you're talking there about really that plants need the carbon to produce glucose and to feed themselves, makes me really wonder about the idea that maybe we need more carbon in the environment. And I think I've come across someone who actually makes that argument that if we wanted a greener planet, more vegetation, more plant life, we actually shouldn't be trying to reduce the carbon in the atmosphere.
I see what you mean. So one thing that's important to remember with all biological systems is this idea of balance. And when we think about this in terms of cell biology or developmental biology, things need to happen at the right time at the right place. Otherwise, you get things like cancer. And when we think about an ecological system, plants need CO2. They absolutely have to have CO2 in order to, it's called fixing carbon, is when they take that CO2 and turn it into chemical energy instead of solar energy. But right now there's just too much carbon and there's too few trees. And so we would have to plant a lot more trees. And even then, I still don't know if it would be an issue, because if there's animals around, well, we breathe oxygen and exhale CO2. So if you have animals walking around, we're constantly making more CO2, and then there's CO2 coming from the cars. And then I mentioned in my book too, this is why burning trees is such a big deal, because not only are you taking an organism away that takes carbon out of the atmosphere, but when you burn it, you're releasing all that stored carbon back. And so I don't see it as we need more CO2 because the trees are going to die problem. I think it's more of a, if humans don't stop cutting down trees, we have a big problem.
Yeah. If we didn't cut down trees, if we didn't destroy any other kind of plants, is that a theory that might make sense then? If there was, with those plants then be able to use, whatever extra CO2s in the atmosphere, if we just left them alone to do that?
Yeah, I'm still not even convinced, because as long as there's people walking around, even if we didn't have cars or any other big sources of CO2, landfills is another huge producer of greenhouse gases as well. Anytime people breathe, I mean, just as part of our natural metabolism, we're making CO2.
Oh no!
So
you're not about to suggest we get rid of people, are you?
No. But what I'm saying is that unless you got rid of everybody and everything that's producing CO2, then maybe you'd make an argument. But I think you'd never get all of those sources of CO2.
Yeah.
Because we're not about to get rid of all the people and all the animals, let alone cars and everything.
So one of the other really fascinating topics that you have that I'm sure like so many people are really interested in is you get into genetics and DNA. And I'm actually, as I'm saying genetics, as I'm saying DNA, thinking about genes, I actually realized that I'm not entirely sure or if they're the same thing. Is DNA and genes, are they the same thing, or is DNA the building blocks that lead to genes, and then the genes kind of build everything else? So maybe you can help educate me on that area a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a good question because what is a gene sounds like such a simple question. And it's actually something that geneticists around the world can't agree on.
Okay.
In part because the definition of a gene has changed so much, just as the field of molecular biology has grown and as new technologies have come around. It's a great example of how science knowledge changes over time in light of new evidence. Because it was initially thought that a gene was just a bit of DNA that coded for a protein. And so you can think of DNA as being like people talk about it as the blueprint or as the cookbook, and then the protein is what you actually make. And the proteins are what do all the jobs in our cells. So they're like little workers that live in our cells. And so it used to be that people thought genes were bits of DNA that made protein. Well, and then discoveries in the 1980s came about RNAs that do work. And so it's just like, okay, well, does a gene something that codes for an RNA that does function, or does it have to code for a protein? And then now with epigenetics coming about, and that gene expression is different. And so you can see how this gets very convoluted.
And maybe this is a good time for me to jump in and ask what RNA is.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can step back a little bit. So when we think about going back to chemistry where we started, there's 4 different kinds of molecules in our bodies. They're called macromolecules. So that's fats, sugars or carbohydrates, proteins, which I mentioned are the workers, and the nucleic acids. And so nucleic acids are DNA and RNA, and they're important because they store information. And so this is the information that gets passed on from parents to their children that explains who we are, what color our hair is going to be, how tall we're going to be, everything that we are. So that's the job of the nucleic acid. So carbs and fats are more involved in energy, transport, and signaling, and proteins are doing function, but the nucleic acids are important for storing information. So DNA is where all of our information is stored. And RNA does a lot of different things, but the key take-home message is that RNA is just a snippet of DNA that we can transport somewhere else. It's kind of like if you were going over to someone's house to cook, let's say you're baking cookies, you wouldn't necessarily bring a gigantic cookbook with you. You'd just bring a single recipe. And that's kind of what RNA does. It's this little piece that we want to copy and turn into protein. And so we just make a short copy of that and then bring it somewhere else.
Okay. And you're talking about proteins, fats, carbohydrates, obviously all those things that we can eat. So are we eating DNA and RNA as well when we're eating foods?
Yes, we are. We eat DNA and RNA anytime we eat something that came from a living creature, whether it's plants. So plants have DNA, which often surprises people, or animals. And obviously animals have DNA as well.
So actually everything living, their basic structure at the bottom of everything, we all have that in common, that we're all built from DNA.
DNA or RNA. So there's some viruses that just have RNA genomes and no DNA.
Okay. And you mentioned there DNA and RNA being like a code that passes kind of information along kind of from your parents to you, and that impacts on kind of who you are, particular characteristics. So did DNA and RNA then have a role to play in evolution as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's thought that RNA probably evolved first, and it's because RNA has the ability to store information and do work. So RNA acts like a nucleic acid, and it is a nucleic acid, but it also can act like a protein as well. So it's thought that we had RNA first.
So how do they actually impact then on how a species evolves over time?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So that gets into DNA. and how DNA changes over time. And so it's very normal for DNA to change or mutate. So we're constantly surrounded by mutagens. UV radiation from the sun is a big example of that. That's why we're always supposed to wear sunscreen when we go outside.
So we don't mutate. Is that what you're saying? Wear your sunscreen?
Yeah. So
if someone told me that when I was little, that might have convinced me.
Yeah, and so there's kind of two parts of this to keep in mind, because evolution doesn't happen at the individual level. We get these mutations that accumulate, and so mutations also cause cancer. So that's the other reason why we should wear sunscreen when we go outside, because these mutations we get in our skin cell can cause cancer. But over time, mutations accumulate across species. So that's important to remember, that evolution occurs across big groups and not individuals. So it doesn't happen at the individual level. And so I always tell my students, and this always makes them laugh, is that biological evolution isn't Pokemon evolution. If you've heard of Pokemon before, because in Pokemon, it's one individual and then they evolve to become a better individual. Because that's another misnomer about evolution, is that we get to be better. And it's not better, there's trade-offs, and it's what's going to be most likely to result in you reproducing at any given time.
I think it sounds very like when you maybe come across these people who have gotten very intensely into meditation or yoga or something. They talk about how they're evolving. I really think of it in that same sort of way.
Yeah, it's a different kind of evolution, but evolution happens across large groups, and so you get these mutations. These are just random mutations; they're normal, they happen. What's not random is if it leads to something that allows you to reproduce better. Because at the end of the day, evolution is about sex. It's about how good you are at passing on your genes. Yeah, well, arguably, yes.
We've just gone very Freudian.
But if you have a mutation and it leads to being able to better pass on your genes, you're more successful. And if you have the same thing happening across the population, that's when you get evolution. And that's when we start to see these changes over time. So people often push back about how much of it's random versus how much of it's not. And so mutations are random, but having something selected for, because it gives you an advantage, that advantage really just comes down to how well you reproduce. That's when we see evolution happening.
And does that really work in the way that you might have a mutation in a species that means that you have some individuals in that species that have that mutation, and maybe they're better able to survive longer, maybe they're better able to find food, and so they then have an increased chance of survival because of that, which gives them an increased chance of reproducing. So then if they're more likely to reproduce, then that mutation is being passed on, and that becomes a much bigger proportion of the next sort of generation of that species. And so that's how it becomes that evolutionary change.
Yeah, exactly. It happens slowly over long periods of time, because we have to wait for generations to occur. So it's really hard to see with humans because we have such a long generation time. It's much easier to see with something like a fly. But yeah, exactly, that there's a change and it gives some kind of advantage, and they're more likely to be able to reproduce, and then that just trickles down. And that's when we start to see a lot of the interesting adaptions.
So then I think there's probably an idea of evolution. It's probably easy for us to think that humans are the end result of evolution, but actually evolution doesn't really care about us in that way. We're not special. All the other species are all still evolving, and humans haven't finished evolving either. We'll still continue to evolve.
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that question, because it's an interesting one to think about. And I think the first piece is that there's no such thing as a final product of evolution. Evolution isn't goal-directed, and there's a lot of what are called evolutionary trade-offs, where something is adaptive, but it's not always that great. And so we see this, and there's a little bit of debate around this in the field too, about the evolutionary trade-offs with humans and having the big brain size, the small pelvis that facilitates people being able to walk upright, and how painful it is for women to go through childbirth. And if this then factors into the fact that humans, compared to the rest of the animal kingdom, are born pretty helpless. And so it's this idea of, oh, it was really good to have the bigger brains evolved because it allowed us to survive better. But at the same time, it made childbirth much riskier too.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that humans have to have an attendant, they need help to give birth, and not a lot of animals don't. And also this idea of, are we at the end of evolution? And it's hard to say because, again, you have to be looking on a grand scale over many generations. Mm-hmm. And so it's hard for us in the course of one lifetime to really ask that question and answer that question. But you have to also wonder about the role of modern medicine in all of this too, because mm-hmm. now people are able to survive and live fairly good lives because of medical interventions. And so does that mean that we have genes, because evolution again comes down to gene frequencies, do we have genes that are sticking around that otherwise wouldn't?
I think we're also seem to be getting to a point when we can talk about switching genes on and off and things like that. So maybe we're just bypassing evolution altogether.
Yeah, absolutely. And then with CRISPR-Cas9, so the ability to go in and edit genes brings up a lot of questions about, is that evolution? Is that not evolution? Because if we're causing these changes, and then we have to think about changes in the germline. And then this, of course, raises a whole bunch of questions about ethics with modifying human genes and then being able to pass those modified genes down. And so it's again, these are, with CRISPR being what it is, and in the US, they have clinical trials going on using gene editing. You know, this is one of those examples of why we need biology everywhere, because it is everywhere, and gene editing brings up a lot of questions. And these are questions that we all have to be ready to engage with and deal with.
So what do you think are the most kind of controversial bits of work that are going on using gene editing?
So this is a hard one. I talk with my students about this quite a bit, because it's easy for a lot of people to get into the doom and gloom and think that all these genetic technologies is going to lead to some kind of global crisis, and it's just all for-profit scientists and this stuff's all bad and people are going to make designer babies.
Yeah, this is the AI question of the biology world, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But at the same time, things like 3-parent babies, which was recently legalized in the United Kingdom, it's still not legal in the US. Man, that's giving people an opportunity to have children who otherwise would not be able to have healthy children. And that's a big deal. But, well, if we have a child that's got biological material from 3 parents, do all 3 parents have parental rights? And that the child obviously can't consent to having this procedure because they were created by this procedure. Mm-hmm. And so we have these issues of consent and parental rights. And then we see that with the gene editing as well. If we're editing embryos, well, they can't consent to the process. But is that okay because we're preventing suffering? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of these questions that come up, and the same thing with sharing sequencing data. People go out and buy these little kits so they could do genotyping at home, and they find out all this information about themselves. And should it be protected information? What rights do people have to this information? I live in Colorado, and they do genotyping for all children born right at birth, because they say, oh, we can check for these genes that are actionable that we can do something about right away. And it's just like, okay, well, these are all childhood diseases. What about checking right when they're born if they also have a predisposition to having celiac disease, or if they have certain markers that we know are associated with responding to certain medications? And so it's this idea of testing to prevent suffering down the road versus telling people information and freaking them out. There was a lot of discussion about the BRCA mutations. And so these are associated with early onset breast cancer, and people getting tested and then being like, oh, well, we're going to prevent my daughter from going through puberty because she's got the BRCA mutations. And it's this idea of, no, just because you have the mutation doesn't mean you'll get cancer. It just means you're more likely to. And so there's this statistics question that goes on top of it, and that people are really bad at gauging risk. But at the same time, do people have a right to have this information because it's going to prevent suffering down the road? Mm-hmm. And so I don't know if I really answered your question necessarily, but I hope I bring up some of these tensions that come up of really being able to help people and prevent suffering, but balancing that with rights and consent.
Yeah, I think if you had answered it in a really clear sort of yes or no way, that would have been a wrong answer. I think it's one of those answers where your answers are actually just more questions.
Yeah,
That seems
exactly.
much more appropriate.
Yeah, and again, it's coming full circle because this is a really good example of where we need to be ready to engage with biology. And if people are, hiding under the bed because they had some terrible experience in biology class, for which I apologize for, you got to be ready to engage and to make these decisions and not just listen to your favorite politician.
So yeah, so to come back full circle, then you're talking about the importance of having that awareness of biology, and you actually start the book talking about the importance of science in general and the scientific method and how science works. And we've also talked a bit about people having a bit of a fear of science, a bit of misunderstanding. How do you think we can go about overcoming that? It seems like at the minute in particular that we have a real issue with not just how people understand science, but the way science is being presented seems to be getting caught up in so much kind of politics and ideology and things that I think really undermines the concept of science and makes it difficult for people to know who to trust and who to listen to. How do you think we can go about trying to go into the future with kind of good science and scientists who can communicate their work and that they have a kind of audience of the general public that has enough scientific knowledge to at least grasp some of the things that's going on and how important those things are?
Yeah, so I think this is a really important question and something I'm asked quite a bit as well. And I think it comes at multiple levels. And there's a huge push in STEM education right now to be more evidence-based and more inclusive. And I think that's important work. And I also in general.
Can I just interrupt you on that one? I'm a bit shocked that STEM education has to pick up the idea of being evidence-based. I thought that would have been I would like to think that that's actually really core to science anyway.
Yes. There's a big push in science education right now for people using evidence-based practices. And this is a big problem in higher education where people just teach the way they were taught. Even if we know that lecture does not work. People do not learn when someone lectures at them. And it was interesting. I was just at a talk a few weeks ago, and somebody was showing a medieval painting of a lecture and showing all the people sleeping. And so it's just like, why have we been doing it this way for hundreds of years? And so it's really hard to get people to change from the way they were taught. And if they're at a university teaching science, that means they made it. And they use the excuse of, well, it worked for me. And it's just like, okay, well, what about everybody else? And so, yes, it does seem like a bit of a misnomer that there's so many people who don't use evidence-based practices in teaching science and then claim to be scientists who are using evidence. But it's a very strange and common problem. And so that's something that I'm working on is, being really evidence-based in the classroom. And so my students can tell you this because I always point out, we're doing this because of this research study. But everything I do in the classroom is based in the science of how people learn.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. I think I always, very interested in martial arts, and I've seen this in lots of areas, not just martial arts, but other areas where you can be really good at something, but it doesn't mean that you're really good at teaching it.
Exactly. And so I think it's that piece, and then just in general for all scientists to really think about the personal aspect of it. And I mean, this applies in classrooms too. And there's a lot of research to back this up as well about being authentic with people and authentic in the classroom. Something that people push back quite a bit on with scientists is the know-it-all attitude. And it doesn't help. It just turns people off to scientists, and it's really easy to believe these stories about scientists as just greedy and arrogant people that nobody wants to listen to. And so
but what if someone is authentically a know-it-all and that's just their personality?
Well, and I've certainly run into scientists that are like that too. But that's another story entirely. But I think people who want to be out in the general public need to present themselves as people first, people who are scientists. And, this people first language is something we hear a lot about with inclusion too. And I think it's important for people to hear about that and to hear about failures. And that's something a lot of students have told me. They appreciate me kind of standing up here and being like, well, here's all the places I failed. And here's where I ended up because of it, because it's easy to just go out and tell these perfect stories about our lives or about science and make it sound like it's easy and straightforward when it's not. And I think coming from that authentic viewpoint, from the perspective of building relationships with people, that's a big problem with science communication too. This idea of a deficit model where we need scientists to go in and just tell people what's going on. And it's just like, no, we need relationships. We need to understand where these attitudes come from. We need to think about what's happening in classrooms to turn people off to science for their entire lives. Someone just messaged me the other day saying that they had one bad biology teacher and that made them decide to not go to medical school. And there's a lot at stake. And so that's why I think it's important that when scientists want to talk to the general public to really be cognizant and careful about how they come off, and also for hopefully trying to get more teachers, especially in higher education, to adopt evidence-based practices because they really do make a difference for students.
Melanie, that sounds like a really brilliant place to wrap up. Thanks very much for that. That's
thank
really
you for having
interesting. I hope we've covered a good bit of your book there. I tried to do a bit of a whirlwind kind of tour, but please tell people how they can find Biology Everywhere and go and buy it and go and read it. It's a really enjoyable read, really informative and really accessible in the ways that you're talking about. So how can people find it? How can they find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So to find out more about me and my work or to buy books in the United States, visit www.biologyeverywhere.com. You can also follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram as Biology Everywhere Book, Twitter at Melanie Peffer, and then on Facebook, Melanie Peffer, PhD. I also have international distribution through Amazon, so you can get paperback books and ebooks on Amazon and also other distributors like Barnes & Noble as well. Fantastic.
And I'll add links to show notes there so everyone can easily find those things. Melanie, that was fantastic. It was really fascinating, and an area of science that I actually don't have a huge amount of knowledge of. I was really going back to my kind of school days trying to think of some of these things, so that was really great. You've really enlightened me in some of these topics, so thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Remember to rate and review the show on your podcast app and spread the word. And get in touch on Twitter or through the website and let me know what topics you'd like to hear in the future. Bye for now.
Curiosity Cake.